So good morning and welcome to chapter 7 of the series of videos, Social and Cultural Changes in the United Kingdom in the 1970s. And I wanted to look at this decade because people are always talking about the 60s when they're talking about social and cultural change. And the discourses we hear about the 70s are often concentrated on social and economic crisis, which is also a very true side of life in the 70s. So that's what I've been doing in this series of videos. And I finished chapter 6 with the information about the launching of pot noodles, which in 1977, which was in a way anecdotal, but at the same time, it seemed to be a symbol of a new lifestyle where young people were away from their parents, wanting to get away from their parents. I remember in the 1970s when we were deciding which university to go to, if we were in the lucky minority that got to go to university, the first thing we did was to cross out any university less than 100 miles from our parents' house, because the whole point was to get away. Also, then in 1977, so they're looking at some things which occurred in 1977 when it doesn't really particularly matter which month, was the publication of Marilyn French's novel, the Women's Room. And you can see there the cover where it says underneath the ladies' room, and it's overwritten with the women's room. And you can see it's on the year's most extraordinary bestseller, and it certainly did sell a lot. I don't know if you can also tell if you know a lot about book covers, but this is an American publication. Indeed, it was an American book. And there you have the subtitle there: "For every man who ever thought he knew a woman, for every woman who ever thought she knew herself." So a little melodramatic, no doubt, but it was tremendously influential. It was written by an American feminist author whose first book had been a thesis on James Joyce, so a person of literary persuasion. And it follows the lives of a group of housewives in 1950s and 1960s America who gradually realized how limited their life as housewives is and want to open up more possibilities. It eventually sold 20 million copies, and it was quite influential in Britain too. Now, social movements do not easily jump from one country to another, and certainly it's worth underlining that the British women's movement was in many ways very different from the US women's movement. This is particularly important to underline in France, because in France people occasionally seem to have the impression that Britain and America are more or less the same place, les pays anglo-saxons, which is fundamentally nonsense. So let's move on to the next year then, 1978. And we're going to start with a few figures, because I think you've always got to have some figures now. 1978, 28.5% of all jobs were in manufacturing industry. So people on the production lines making all sorts of things. My mother worked in a card factory for part of the 70s, and then in a factory which produced the electrical wirings for car engines. So we're talking about repetitive jobs, not very well paid. But 28.5% of all jobs were in manufacturing industry. By 2009, the figure was just 10%. So we're in a process where more and more manufacturing is farmed out, if you like, farmed out to China, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. And the service industry is on the rise. This no doubt had very wide-ranging social and cultural implications. The idea of the strong man, where physical strength was most important, seemed to fit better with an age of manufacturing industry than it did with an age of service industry, marketing, communication, and then later computing. Also in 1978, there were 13 million trade union members in the United Kingdom. Now, even today, there are far more in the United Kingdom than in France, but that was one of the high points of the trade union movement. This is not necessarily a big mystery. When trade unions win strikes and conflicts, people join them, and when they lose, people don't join them so much. It seems to be unsurprising, but important to underline. So let's get into 1978 then. 1978 in February, you had the first episode of the BBC One series Grange Hill, which was about everyday life in a secondary school. And it was broadcast to some controversy, and it continued to be broadcast until 2008. This was aimed at teenagers, and this was a soap opera. That several stories were played followed at the same time, and there was an attempt to attack certain questions which might cause conflict or tension or misunderstanding in society. And so I remember there is a case which is a little later, I'm pretty sure not in the 70s, where you had the first openly homosexual character in Grange Hill. This is also the time of the comic science fiction series, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was first broadcast as a radio series on BBC Radio 4, starring a confused suburban man and a manic depressive robot. The series broke new ground in absurd humor. And one of the more memorable dialogues is when one of the characters says to the other that they're going to pass through a highly technological sort of travel machine, and the man says, "Oh, does it hurt?" And the second gentleman says, "Well, it's a bit like being drunk." And the first man says, "Well, that doesn't sound so bad." To which the reply comes, "You should ask a glass of water." April 1978, the first official naturist beach in Britain was inaugurated in Brighton after a debate in the Conservative-dominated local council. And radio broadcasts of all debates in the House of Commons began. This was also the moment, and this is a moment when the far right is gaining some influence. As unemployment gets higher, the far right has some success persuading people that this is all because of the immigrants. A very familiar cry, which we can still hear today, of course, about Muslims. And it would never get to the strength of the Front National in France, but you were having local elections when the National Front was getting 20–30% of the vote, and one of the responses to this was the foundation of the Anti-Nazi League, and there you can see one of their meetings. The policy of the Anti-Nazi League was to get out as much information as possible about the Nazi links of the National Front, so door to door in towns where there'd been a lot of votes, and little badges against the Nazis, which were designed for particular groups. So, postal workers against the Nazi, Guardian readers against the Nazis, West Ham supporters against the Nazis. It was slightly humorous, but extremely common symbol seen at the time. And this was also used to establish Rock Against Racism, which was a sort of sister campaign. This was also the moment of the National Women's Liberation Conference 1978. This was the 8th and the last time that a National Women's Liberation Conference was held. Now, many commentators have since put the emphasis on the changes that were wrought by the women's liberation movement in Britain, and the fact that there were continuations in whether it was within the Labour Party or within local councils or within education, within universities, and within publishing, that there was a very wide-ranging and creative and fruitful legacy, and this is certainly true. On the other hand, the last Women's Liberation Conference was in 1978. It was extremely divided, and it was so divided that no further conference was ever organized. And it seems to me difficult not to count this as a failure, because a national Women's Liberation Conference every couple of years or every 3 years, it would seem to be something which could be key to building an activist approach to women's liberation, which is what the women's liberation movement was about. Now, the divisions in the conference were particularly sharp between, on the one hand, Marxist feminists who claimed that capitalism was at the root of the supposed need for unpaid domestic work and for division between men and women, and that the solution was in working class unity, such as the support for Grunwick had shown. And these Marxist feminists, or the people close to them, would consider that the fact that women did most of the housework, most of the childcare, was not fundamentally profiting their husbands, but was fundamentally profiting the capitalist system and the bosses who were provided with new workers, clean and fed and educated for very cheap, because this was free work being done by women. And on the other hand, you had the tenets of patriarchy theory, who claimed that the fundamental division in society was between men and women. So, for example, the patriarchy theorists, sometimes called radical feminists, would always defend the idea that one of the fundamental reasons for war was male aggressivity, whereas the Marxists would say, no, you've got to look at oil or whatever the resources are, which are engaged. So this didn't seem to be, so this crystallized around this question, you know, do working class men benefit from women's oppression? And this didn't seem to, this was carried out at a fairly high tempo. This division, the debate, perhaps this row, was carried out at a fairly high temperature. And so that meant that it was the end of the women's liberation conferences, not the end of women's liberation networks. It's true that as we move into the 80s, I am more and more tempted to use the word networks and not the word movement, because for me, movement, you're talking about tens of thousands of people regularly involved in activity. In the summer, Andrew Lloyd Webber's new musical Evita came out, a biographical story about an Argentinian politician. And it ran for 7 years, and it ushered in the golden age of London musical comedies. And for a number of years, for 10 years, the London shows were the most renowned in the world. This was also the first ever, in Britain, the first ever, what we used to say at the time, horrible expression, test tube baby, or the birth of the first ever baby who had been fertilized in vitro. This is also the time, who is this gentleman left? I've got here, I've forgotten to write down who he is. I'm pretty sure he's the first England, the first black football player to play for England, but I don't seem to have the notes here to actually confirm that. And so moving on then to the last year here, but I have another couple of things to say about 1978 first. There was, yes, there you go. Viv Anderson became, at 22 years of age, England's first black international footballer, appearing in a friendly match against Czechoslovakia at Wembley. And also in 78, there was another Nobel Prize for a British gentleman, Peter Mitchell, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his contribution to the understanding of biological energy transfer through the formulation of the chemiosmotic theory. So I'm sure you know more about that than me, which would not be very difficult. So finally then, moving into 1979, at this time in 1979, the surveys about how people were living gave some interesting answers. According to surveys, among single women, 8% were cohabiting. That is, among unmarried women, 8% were living with a partner who they were not married to. By 1998, this was 31%. So from 8% to 31%. So you can see that we do have, and it does take quite a time. It begins, but then it takes quite a time to drift through society. You do get more and more acceptability of living together without being married. Now, this reflects both the gradual acceptance of the older generation, so that your parents are not so furious anymore, And secondly, no doubt the gradual reduction of parental authority and the idea that you wouldn't do it if your parents didn't agree was on the descent. Certainly, in my family, I noticed a huge difference between the attitude of my parents in 1977 and the attitude of my parents 20 years later. I was talking about different siblings in the family. February 1979, you saw the death of Sid Vicious, which is perhaps anecdotal, really, but it was another one in the series of rock and rollers dying young. And in April 1979, there was in an anti-Nazi League demonstration, there was a young teacher who was killed by the police, by the Special Patrol Group. And he was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, had been organizing a campaign against a pub which refused to serve black people. And the fact that a white protester should be killed while trying to fight racism had a great effect on black and Asian anti-racist organizations who had sometimes been skeptical about the possibility of winning white people to fight racism. Although the five members of the Special Patrol Group involved in killing Blair Peach were known, none of them were prosecuted, even though an internal inquiry showed that some of them were were in possession of crowbars and baseball bats. Blair Peach has been honored in different ways. At the time, Lyndon Kwesi Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a song for him, Reggae for Peach. And today, there is a primary school in Southall in London named after Blair Peach. In May 1979, London Underground opened a new underground line, the Jubilee Line. And in the same month, former Liberal Party leader Jeremy Thorpe went on trial charged with attempted murder of his alleged lover. Now, that's fairly anecdotal, but what is important is he was acquitted. But what was important is that the fact that Jeremy Thorpe was homosexual was considered at the time to be not quite proof that he was a murderer, but proof that he was a very, very immoral sort. So this is the end of the 70s, but you can still have the newspapers in particular putting forward the idea that, you couldn't really be completely normal if you were a homosexual. It's a measure of the changes which have come about since, that all gay members of parliament in 1970s Britain tried to keep their sexuality a secret. The first member of parliament to publicly declare his homosexuality was Labour MP Chris Smith in 1984. And the first Conservative MP to come out was Alan Duncan in 2002. The first member of the House of Lords to be public about being gay was Labour Lord Wahid Ali in 1998. Now we have in 1979 the referendum, as promised earlier in the decade, asking the Scottish if they wanted a separate parliament in Edinburgh, which would deal with a number of important questions, but not certain key questions such as the military. Now, I'm sure you remember the later history. In 1997, after another referendum, in 1999, after another referendum in 1997, there will be a Scottish Parliament. But in 1979, it was not successful because although a slight majority, 51.6%, said, yes, we do want a Parliament in Edinburgh, there had been a special rule written into the law saying that unless 40% of all the electorate voted yes, then the result was not going to count. So to put it simply, too many people stayed at home for the result to count. The important, records released that year included the Gang of Four, post-punk, and Pink Floyd's The Wall, which is no doubt better known. And this is also the time of the Clash's album London Calling. the government published the housing bill. This is now in May 1979. Margaret Thatcher had been elected prime minister, and so we have the new Conservative government, which was widely considered to be the harbinger of a radical change in public policy along neoliberal lines. And although the Thatcher governments had to take it very slowly, a little bit at a time, they certainly went a very long way in reducing the centrality of public services in British life. Although there were some elements, for example, free doctors and free hospitals, which the Conservative government did not dare touch, which is an interesting point. Even the best elected government cannot do just anything they want. But this was also the moment, one of their first and very clever laws was the housing bill, which obliged local councils to sell houses to the tenants who wish to buy them. So in Britain, low-cost housing is organized by the councils, what we call council housing, and how it was supposed to work was it allowed councils to provide fairly low-cost housing to people who needed it, and those people who lived in the council housing who wanted to buy their own house because they made a little bit more money, well, they had to leave the council house and go and buy in the private sector, which left the council house open for somebody who needed it. That's the public service welfare state approach. Whereas the Conservative Party was convinced that the more people owned their own houses, the more people would support neoliberal individualist ways of looking at the world, and therefore conservative politics. This is not necessarily true, actually, but it's certainly what they thought. And so this is what they brought in, this law, which obliged local councils to allow their tenants to buy the house they were living in at a pretty cheap price. And so reducing the number of people living in rented houses and raising the number of people owning their own house. In a stroke of political genius, the Conservative government decided to name this campaign The Right to Buy. That is to say that if you live in a house where you rent, it's much better to have your own house which you own. And so we, the Conservative government, are giving you the right to buy the house you live in. So it appeared to be a campaign defending human rights. And that was very successful, and that's what the campaign was called. Whereas, of course, if opposition to the Thatcher government had been more powerful, perhaps they might have been able to insist that the campaign be named or be popularly known as the obligation to sell, that councils are forced to sell their houses to social climbers. Very end of 1979, then, a few undated events in 1979. Dame Josephine Barnes became the first woman president of the British Medical Association. So this is, again, and this will go on over at least 50 years, the first woman to do this. The very first Wetherspoons pub was opened, a new model selling cheap food in pubs. And a number of, I don't have any more slides, but two publications from the time then. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was published. It had originally been a radio play. And finally, the first issue of Viz Comic was published, which is not necessarily very tasteful, well, rather tasteless, but a new departure in popular vulgar humor in Britain. So we got to the end of the decade, and the whole idea was obviously to trace some changes which were interesting and to try to situate long-term processes which may be accelerating or slowing with particular, sometimes accidental key events. So this idea is looking at events and processes and statistics and bringing them together to have some sort of idea of the texture of public life. And I already mentioned describing or defining or explaining the texture of public life is something historians love to think they are doing, but it is very difficult to prove that we are actually doing that that successful. So I hope that this series of videos has taught you something about the history of 1970s United Kingdom, and also something about the nature of social and cultural history. Thank you very much for listening. That was the last video in this series. Goodbye.